morning, everyone. If you were lucky enough to get a seat in the class this morning, good morning to you here, and good morning to all the people who are somewhere out there also watching and wanting to learn. I'm Kit Leggett of the Social Sciences Committee, and we're going to hear the very first Great Decisions presentation this morning, the fall of 2022. And I think you already know that it's called Examining Global Demographic Changes. And we're going to hear a lot of things, a lot of different, we're going to hear about things on various levels. Some of them are social, economic, political, environmental, and then the consequences of these changing demographics on international relations, security, climate, the environment, and the sustainability of human population here. And before I introduce our guest, whom you may know, we're asking that you check your cells to make sure that they are turned off. Everybody in the room.
Full screen.
And when you want to ask a question, will you make sure that you have this mic in hand before you start asking your question? We'll make sure you get this mic to you so that everybody can hear. And we will not be taking any questions until the end of the presentation today. Well, once again, you're back to hear one of your favorites. Presenter today is Dr. Fred Johnson. He is a professor of history at Hope College, and he's been there for 22 years, maybe more. He has degrees from Bowie State and Kent State. He's a Marine Corps vet. And here's something about him you may not know. And I don't know if he'll speak about this today, but we might do a class later on about this. He is a member of the teaching staff for the Muskegon Correctional Facility. There's a program that has been devised by Hope College and Western Theological Seminary in conjunction with the Muskegon Correctional Facilities team. And Fred is on their staff teaching the American Civil War, isn't it? The American Civil War to some of the scholar inmates who are currently housed at the facility, and they are working on a bachelor's degree, a diploma. So that's very exciting, especially to you.
Yes.
Especially to you. So if those phones are all turned off, we can begin.
Thank you.
Dr. Fred Johnson.
Thank you, Kit. Thank you very much.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2022, a masterclass brought to you by the Foreign Policy Association. For more than a century, the FPA has sought to promote a public dialogue in world affairs and U.S. foreign policy. Toward that aim, it offers its annual Great Decisions program. The editors at the FPA select 8 challenges, or great decisions, confronting the American public and our foreign policy makers. Many chapters on each of the 8 topics is bound in the Great Decisions Handbook. For information on all Great Decisions material, please visit fpa.org. The topics for 2022 are changing demographics, outer space, climate change, Russia and the United States, Myanmar and ASEAN, the Quad Alliance, drug policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean, and industrial policy. In 2022, we're offering a bonus lecture, The Biden Foreign Policy Agenda. Without further ado, let's look at our first great decision of 2022, changing demographics. To do so, we'll look at 3 main considerations. The first is the sheer numbers, how many people on the planet. Next is the location of those populations, And finally is the movement of people or human migration. Once we've done so, we'll be ready to consider foreign policy options. First, however, let's talk a little bit about the importance of demographics for a nation, past, present, and future. If you were to ask me to predict the future of a nation, Turkey in 10 years, China at mid-century, Russia at the year 2100, I would collect 3 bits of information for that analysis. First, I'd look at the geography of the country. How rich is the soil? What are the natural resources? Do the rivers connect major population centers? Do the mountains protect from without dividing within? Next, I'd look at the geostrategic location. That's where the country is relative to other major powers at the regional and international level. And then finally, I look at the demographics, the population, and the population trend line. Based upon these 3 considerations, we can get a pretty clear idea of where countries will be moving forward. If we look at the population tree for the world, it's a pretty healthy pyramid. It isn't overly top-heavy. It's not narrowing at the base. Looking simply at this trend line, we can project that between now and mid-century, the Earth will increase its population by roughly 25%. Compare that to Japan, which has a miserable population tree, top-heavy, and then every group below the age of 44 is smaller than the one that preceded it. Japan's population is disappearing before our eyes, and it will have to make some very hard decisions about immigration in particular. Italy is no better off. This is something we see happening in many advanced Western societies. As people become wealthier, they don't have the need for large numbers of children. They have savings accounts, retirement portfolios. They don't have to worry about 2 or 3 grown sons taking care of them in their own age. Young ladies stay in college longer, they start their own businesses, and as a result in the Western world, what we're seeing happening in Japan and Italy is in many ways the future of France, Spain, Denmark, and many others. This is the reason that there are millions of homes that are unoccupied in Japan and Italy. You may have seen the advertisements, a home in Italy for €1, one in Japan for 100 yen. They're doing everything they can to bring people into the country because of their demographic crisis in the not too distant future. Russia suffers from a similar demographic challenge. You can see the winnowing out at the base. Russia's population is in clear decline and in need of reversal. This helps us understand why Russia puts so much pressure on Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, talking at times about re-adding them to the Russian Federation, reversing the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Part of that calculation is demographic. And if we go to somewhere like Syria, we see the exact opposite. This is the fastest growing population in the world in a country that struggles mightily to take care of its current population. The United States has a very healthy population pyramid. There is some winnowing at the base. However, immigration has gone a long way to preventing the U.S. from suffering the same fate as Japan and Italy. We presently have 331 million people in the country. By 2050, the consensus projection is 379. We're not growing too quickly. We're not shrinking in size. This is a very healthy trend line for the United States and one reason to be bullish on U.S. futures moving forward. Immigration policies, today's great decision, will go a very long way in determining whether the American population continues to grow moving forward. Here we can see several different projections of U.S. demographic change over time, between now and 2060. If we were to cut off immigration completely, our population would be smaller in 40 years than it is today. Low immigration, main immigration, and high immigration estimates are all provided. So the U.S. has many tools at its disposal to address this demographic challenge. The most obvious is that of immigration. Let's now look at the numbers. Population has grown worldwide significantly since 1900. When my grandmother was born at the turn of the century, there were 1.6 billion people on the planet. By mid-century, despite 2 devastating world wars and a global pandemic, the Spanish flu of 1917, the population was up to 2.6 billion. By the year 2000, we hit 6 billion, and today we are at 8 billion. Projections moving forward, as noted earlier, are for a 25% increase to roughly 10 billion people by 2050. When I first started studying world politics in the early 1980s, the consensus projection was 12 billion and the upper level was closer to 20 billion. I don't think we ever hit the 10 billion mark, given the rapid aging that is happening in most of the world. Next is the location of the population. As we look at a world map, we note that 60% of all of the people alive today are on the continent of Asia. Africa has 17%. Europe, which for centuries was the political, economic, and military center of the world, slightly below 10%. And here in the Americas, North, South, Central, and the Caribbean, roughly 12% of the world's population resides in our hemisphere. Populations are increasing in Asia and Latin America, but not terribly quickly. Compare that with Africa, which has the highest rate of population growth, 2.5% annually. Now, to put that into basic terms, that means in 30 years, Africa's population is going to double in size. Where all of those people are going to live, how they'll find the resources to provide for them, and of course the human migration likely to result from that rapid growth in population in Africa is relatively certain. Now, the people don't simply live in continents and in countries, they also live in countrysides and in cities. If we look at the planet's population roughly 100 years ago, it was overwhelmingly rural. A small portion of society lived in the cities. But over the course of the 1900s, things have leveled out. In fact, in 2007, for the very first time, there was a balance. Half of the world's population in rural areas and half in the urban or city areas. By 2050, the expectation is that roughly 70% of all humans will live in urban centers. This puts enormous pressure on governments to provide services. So what does that mean if everyone's moving towards the cities? First of all, it's a very real threat to biodiversity, because as these cities build out, get larger, as suburban areas and beyond develop, that can threaten the biodiversity balance. Next, we experience a very real water challenge, because cities are largely concrete. Lakes and rivers are diverted, they're changed to accommodate the people. Very rarely do urban centers collect enough rainfall for the growing population. And that means we have real challenges in delivering water to those people. Third, the challenge of air pollution. It's the industry, the automobiles, the homes, all of it creating pollution. Because people are increasingly concentrated in cities, it's much easier for diseases, the annual influenza or the once-in-a-century pandemic, to spread very, very quickly. Emissions from automobiles and industries, CO2 and methane into the air, is a real problem related to urbanization. And then finally, the reality of slums. where people are pushed to the periphery and beyond of the cities because they can no longer afford to live there. They may well work in the cities, but they need transportation to get them into the place where their jobs are located. Here at the Foreign Policy Association, we try our best to be balanced. Here are 6 very real problems associated with urbanization. On the other side of the coin, however, is the reality that urbanization is part of industrial society, modern world politics, and because of the global trading system, prosperity has exploded over the course of the last century, and especially since World War II. This is a very positive part of urbanization, which allows for economies of scale. Next, we look at human migration, the movement of people. Since 1500, the onset of modern world politics, people have moved largely from Europe to the Americas and from Africa to the Western Hemisphere. The Europeans moved by volition. The Africans were brought as part of the slave trade, and from South Asia, people moved all over the globe. Today, we see human migration largely moving from south to north, from underdeveloped countries to developed countries, and then on to the highly developed economic elite countries of Western Europe, North America, and Oceania. This graph provided by the World Economic Forum shows us where people are moving to. The tan areas like Australia, Western Europe, and North America, that's the traditional destination of migrants. Then if you look at the darker areas, portions of South Africa, Eastern Europe, those are the new destinations, in addition to the traditional, of course, of immigration. And then the brownish areas in the middle, those are the highest volume of migration sources. People are moving from rural China to the coastline for the excitement, for the jobs, for the opportunity. The frontline states in Southern Africa are moving to South Africa, which is much more economically developed, and many from the Middle East are escaping the wars and the repression on their way to Europe, East, Central, and West. We divide migration into broad categories: voluntary and involuntary. You move voluntarily to find a better job, involuntarily to find any job at all. Voluntarily, you move to join your family in another country. Involuntary is when you bring your family with you for fear of persecution or danger. Voluntary migration is to enjoy the better freedoms in Western Europe or North America, while the involuntary is largely driven to avoid persecution for political beliefs, for skin color, ethnicity, language, or religion. 2 very different categories of migration. If it is voluntary, the rules are basically embedded in domestic law. Involuntary migration, refugees, asylum seekers, that's dictated by both domestic and international law. Let's look at the involuntary side first. There is an international law for refugees. When an individual crosses an international boundary out of a well-founded fear of harm, upon arrival, they're designated as a refugee and they are allowed the right to claim asylum. They are claiming the right to ask for asylum. Asylum is a wholly domestic determination, and very oftentimes it involves a very complicated legal process. In each country, the asylum laws vary, and how judges interpret a well-founded fear of harm varies greatly from one judicial system to another. Migration into the United States has increased and done so sharply in the post-World War II era, especially since the Cold War ended and we became truly global as an economic system. As you can see in 2020, in the neighborhood of 43 million people migrated into the United States. That's a very healthy portion of our overall population of 330 million. Where do they go? Not surprisingly, the major ports of call on the West Coast, in Texas, South Florida, and the eastern seaboard. Migration hit Europe in 2016 like never before. 1 million people migrated from the Middle East and North Africa because of the armed conflicts happening there, climate change that had devastated their jobs, and the advent of robotics and artificial intelligence, which was taking their place in the workforce. The Europeans were wholly incapable of working as a group in responding to these migration waves. Hungary, Germany treated migrants in completely different fashion, even though both are members of the European Union and both are bound by the same international laws. We can now consider American foreign policy options. We'll do so by looking at them in these two categories, preemptive versus reactive. Do we deal with migrants when they arrive in the United States? That would be reactive. Or do we attempt to address the underlying causes that brought those people to our border in the first place? Let's begin with the reactive. Here we have two countries, one green, one yellow, separated by an international boundary. People from that country are moving to the right, and when they do so, they confront a barrier. It could be a physical wall, it could be a legal boundary. There will obviously be ports of entry because neighboring countries almost always trade with one another. So as these people enter through the legal port, they're going to go through a processing center. They'll enter one side, they'll exit from the other, and they'll be confronted by a court system with judges that apply the laws of the country and the international binding rules. Some of those will make it through the court system and be released to the host country, be asked to return later for further processing. Others will be deported back to their country of origin. Still others will enter the country illegally. Those will confront law enforcement. And they may end up in a set of cages, like we see from the Obama administration, or very similar cages from the Trump administration. Or possibly they'll confront law enforcement on horseback, whipping them back into Mexico in the Biden administration. This is one of the great challenges we confront these days when unaccompanied migrant children arrive on the border. You can't very easily process them without knowing who they are or even what country they came from, and it's certainly very difficult to detain them for long or send them back to their country of origin without a parent to look after them. How about the underlying causes of migration? Maybe that's a better place to construct foreign policy. The problem here is that the challenges abroad are incredibly great and our leverage may not be outstanding. Conflicts abroad, repression by governments that are dictatorial, job dislocation for a variety of reasons, including climate change, that can make a place inhospitable. Or maybe it's simply the economic and lifestyle inequalities in the world. Even in the poorest countries, they have access to Wi-Fi. They see the lives that we lead, the safety of our streets, the opportunity to work and earn a respectful living. That draws people into the United States. There is a simple reality about migration that is unavoidable. It's a reality in world politics. People have been migrating for as long as people have existed, and there's no reason to believe they're going to stop anytime soon. Most of the migration is happening from south, underdeveloped and struggling economies, to the north, developed political, social, and economic orders. Our border will never be airtight. If we wanted it to be, we probably could not accomplish that, even by building the tallest and widest of walls or hiring large numbers of migration officials. And finally, and very importantly, migration between countries historically is directly linked to trade. If we trade with a country, we migrate there and they migrate here. The higher the volume of trade, the higher the volume of migration, as indicated here. Presidential policies. Let's compare two of them, Donald Trump and Joseph Biden. Mr. Trump was highly critical of free trade agreements and very restrictive on immigration. This is logically consistent, understanding that trade is linked to migration. We don't know if it was Mr. Trump's concern over migration that led him to be critical of free trade agreements, or they simply lined up in his agenda. Mr. Biden, on the other hand, largely supports free trade agreements and is much more lenient on immigration. That seems to indicate a conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat divide on issues like free trade and migration. But that would be a mistake. If we go back to the 1980s, President Reagan was a champion of free trade and among the most lenient American presidents on immigration with his amnesty proposal. So it's not so simple as to look at party ID or even philosophical location on the spectrum. Each president will have his or her own view of free trade and immigration. They should line up, as these do, but it's not unusual to see politicians mix and match their policies. This concludes the first of 9 lectures in this master class. Thank you for attending. Stay engaged and make great decisions.
Good morning. Well, thank you. That was a wonderful foundation to get started. As you have seen from that presentation, the 21st century is full of change and challenges. At times, because of immigration and population movement, it can seem like the world is on fire. So many problems affecting so many people across the planet. And the faces of the refugees and people who are moving, their faces tell the story, what people are confronting. Kit mentioned that I'm teaching at the Muskegon Correctional Facility, and I am every Friday morning from 7:10 to 10:30. And I got to tell you that, speaking of the looks on people's faces, I'm reminded each time I leave that place, walking out, I have a renewed appreciation for freedom and being able to go where you want and do what you want and not have to ask permission for each and every movement during the day. Likewise, when I look at these faces, I am reminded and have a renewed appreciation for living in the United States, which for all of its problems, do not have some of the problems that these folk are confronting. They're moving by boat. They're moving across the land. It is stressful. I explained it to my students the other day like this. We were talking about European migration in the 16th and the 17th century and how that compares to today. And of course, migration for the United States is a big problem. But I said, think of it like this. If you had a choice of living someplace comfortably and having a decent job and taking care of your family, or picking up and moving to a place where you're going to be harassed by the government, probably lose your profession, be put into uncertainty for an unknown amount of time, and you had to do that in an essentially hostile environment to maybe the second or third generation of your children, would you do that? Or would you stay where you were and just continue to live? People migrate, generally speaking, because, as the presentation pointed out, they're looking for opportunity, or in the case of so much of what these pictures indicate, people are trying to simply just get someplace where their lives are not being threatened. Their literal existence is not being threatened. So much of what is going on the planet has to do with population control, human migration, famine, sustainability. And of course, we're talking about this morning, demography. Now, demography and demographic changes can be a very good thing. If you are generally speaking in world history, when nations have had an increase in population, that was seen as being a good sign because people coming to your area means they're coming to something that you have to offer, or they're providing a labor force that can be good for your economy. They're providing more diversity for the area. There can be forced migration, as of course the transatlantic slave trade was. But either way, generally speaking, an increase in population is seen as a good, healthy sign that an economy and a society are on the upswing. As the presentation also pointed out, there's a definite divide between the global north and the global south. And there are push-pull factors. The things that are pushing people when it comes to making them leave their home countries, generally speaking, the pushes aren't all that great. They involve disaster from the climate, conflict, civil wars, and there are more than enough of those going on. And violence. For example, the violence from the drug cartels along the US-Mexico border or in Mexico itself. So people are fleeing these. And in the case of the violence, it would be very helpful for us to remember that so much of what's going on, particularly in Central America, what they call Mesoamerica, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, not so much Costa Rica and Honduras. A lot of that has to do with failed policies, foreign policies, going back all the way to the early 20th century, some all the way back to the 19th century, where these countries have had vast gaps between wealth, between those who have and those who have not just nothing, but absolutely nothing. So if you want to stop immigration from one thing, particularly when it comes to the violence, American foreign policy from the outside can have a mass effect on that. The pull options include, well, people want health, wealth, and happiness, to live lives where they can raise their families, not be harassed for who they are, not be in danger of losing their lives. I want to do a map survey with us for a second, because this from some research I was doing just a couple of days ago shows some immigration patterns from 2001 to 2015. Now, bear with me as I read. 2001 saw roughly 500,000 refugees fleeing primarily Middle Eastern countries, such as Afghanistan and Macedonia, and African countries such as Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, in 2001, many of you have heard of something called the Darfur crisis. Darfur at one point was on everybody's lips. The Janjaweed, and it's just the people in Sudan, typical situation going on with regard to ethnicities on the African continent, where primarily the northern part of Sudan is, just to make it simple, the northern part of Sudan is generally referred to or considered to be Arabic-speaking Sudan or Muslim Sudan, and the southern part is considered to be Black African Sudan or Christian Sudan. A few years ago, there was a movement made inside of Sudan that people thought was going to bring peace to the country, where they divided the country between North and South Sudan. It lasted for all of 6 or 7 months before they broke out into civil war over a brand new issue. So the issues persist again. Then, if you look at this, by 2002, both the number of newly displaced refugees and total refugees had fallen since 2001, but still large numbers of people fled war-torn African countries for safer neighboring nations or havens in Europe. Now, there is a thing called United States Africa Command, which was created in the wake of 9/11. It is based in Stuttgart, Germany. I'm still trying to challenge myself on understanding how something that's called Africa Command can better serve the needs of the continent based in Stuttgart. But on the other hand, given the instability on the continent in so many places, having a command center in Stuttgart probably is not such a bad idea. Either way, we should not underestimate the impact of immigration from the African continent to Middle Eastern countries and to Europe proper. We also cannot be naive about this. People who are immigrating from sub-Saharan Africa, in addition to issues of race and religion, they're bringing languages and other differences of culture, which place stresses on those other European countries which are already having their own internal challenges, particularly in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, the wounds from the early 1990s Serbo-Croatian wars have not yet healed. In fact, the Serbo-Croatian wars, if nothing else, were nothing more than an echo from 1914, where World War I broke out there anyway. So Eastern Europe, particularly the Balkans countries, are always on the verge of something terrible going on. Due to the war in Darfur in Sudan, primarily in 2003 primarily saw an outflow of refugees from Sudan to nearby Chad. The UNHCR estimates roughly 100,000 new refugees came from Sudan alone. Now, Chad, if you had to choose a country to run to, Chad is not the place. Okay, Chad has its own problems with a Muslim-Christian conflict going on inside of it. It's gone through. Lake Chad was once one of the largest bodies of water on the African continent. Because of increasing desertification, it has shrunk in recent years, adding and exacerbating the competition between the pastoralists and farmers. So the people that have cows and animals that need to be watered, and those who grow their food for a living, two different kinds of economy. Because believe me, I saw one time in Kenya a man who had 1,000 camels and about just as many cattle. That guy would be rich here. He was super wealthy in Kenya. He also had 4 wives. So he could afford to have that. So he was wealthy when it came to his wives. His wealth was reflected not only in the amount of land that he had and his livestock, but the fact that he could have 4 wives said that he was a very wealthy man, because in that particular culture, if you have a wife and you cannot take care of her, then you are ridiculed. For 2004, Sudanese migration continued into 2004, in addition to waves of Afghani refugees fleeing into Pakistan and Iran. The US also saw an uptick that year due to an influx of Somali refugees. Now, 2004, remember that by 2004, we had launched something in 2003 called Operation Iraqi Freedom, the second venture into Iraq. So that added further destabilization for the Middle East. Also, because of what happened in Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11, we were already conducting the global war on terror. So you had people leaving Afghanistan, people leaving Iraq, and there was a rise of somebody called Muqtada al-Sadr and his Mahdi militia, which further destabilized Iraq, even in the wake of Saddam Hussein's toppling and eventual capture. Now, Pakistan has been more in the category of being a frenemy, and the constant conflicts with India regionally have produced some serious population pressures that cause people to go out from those countries into other areas. By the end of 2005, the total number of refugees had hit its lowest point since 1980, with an estimated 8.4 million refugees worldwide. That's 1 million fewer than the start of 2005. Pakistan and Iran were the 2 main asylum points. Do you know how desperate you have to be to go to Iran as a destination country? Iran has a theocracy. It is a tyrannical. I don't care if it's called a Muslim. It's really not Muslim. It's a form of Islam, I guess they call it. But that government is nothing more than despotic. So to go there means that people they're truly desperate to leave from wherever they were to go to Iran for relief, which just boggles the imagination. Within the year, the number climbed back to 9.9 million refugees worldwide. 2006 saw the Lebanon war drive people into Syria and Germany, as well as the Sri Lanka civil war driving citizens to India. 2007, numbers continued to rise, get 11.4 million refugees by 2007. Moves were driven by ongoing conflict in Eastern Africa. That would be in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. We should also include Burundi and Rwanda as well, because the conflict in Burundi and Rwanda, and especially Rwanda, what happened in the wake of the Rwandan genocide in 1994 was that the perpetrators literally got away with murder. They fled across the border into the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, set up fiefdoms in these refugee camps, and essentially just lived like refugee kings in the midst of very frightened people. So those conflicts just pause for a minute. They never do get resolved. They pause for a moment, and the people who are living there, the ones who are the victims, are living side by side with the perpetrators, which must leave them in a constant state of fright. In 2008, Afghan and Iraqi refugees accounted for half of the total number gathered by the UNHCR. India also became a major asylum for roughly 100,000 Tibetan refugees. Somali refugees continue to pour into surrounding countries. Now, Somalia, depending upon the day of the week, Somalia has been said to have a collapsed government or a non-functioning government, or has been a dysfunctional society. Recall that in 1993, the United States came to the aid of Somalia, trying to bring food to the Somali people who are undergoing a severe famine, essentially a man-made famine, because Mohammed Farah Aidid, a Somali warlord, was using food as a weapon. So the US deployed troops to Somalia, and what became just a terrible, terrible dilemma for the Clinton administration. Do you use the military for food relief? Is that the military's job? On that occasion, the answer was yes. To bring some relief, they tried to capture Mohammed Farah Aidid, and it turned into something called the Battle of Mogadishu. If you've ever read the book or seen the movie Black Hawk Down, that's what that devolved into. Aidid never was caught. The Somali people continue to live in a state of chaos for the most part, although there's also a problem with Somali pirates. In 2009, Germany became the epicenter of asylum seekers in 2009 due to a plea from the European Union for it to resettle displaced migrants. Iraqi refugees continue to make up a major share of the total population. As we moved into 2010, Thailand saw surges of Myanmar refugees in 2010 due to an ongoing civil war in Myanmar, or formerly Burma. A wave of migrants from Cuba also made their way to the US and Puerto Rico that year. In 2011, Congolese, Sudanese, and Somali refugees made up the largest portion of displaced persons, flowed slow to Europe, while Haitian refugees made their way to the US and Dominican Republic. Now, if you don't know this, you should know that for people in Haiti to go to the Dominican Republic means that they're also not just irritated or inconvenienced, they're desperate, because the Haitians and the Dominicans have no love for each other, particularly when it comes to the Dominicans. They look down their noses at the Haitians. They think they're a lesser form of people. There's just a whole lot of no love lost between those two countries sitting side by side. 2012, the Syrian civil war was in full swing by 2011. Tens of thousands of migrants flowed south into Jordan and north into Germany, Sweden, and other European countries. Infighting in Sudan and Somalia held steady. Now, 2011 and 2012, the unique thing about 2011 and 2012 was this. 2011 was the year that a man in Tunisia, fed up with the way life was in Tunisia and the response, or more specifically, the lack of response from the government, set himself on fire. Think back to the time of Vietnam when that monk set himself on fire. So this guy set himself on fire as a protest to the government. And then the Tunisian people essentially ran their dictator, who had been in charge for many, many years, ran him out of the country. And this began a process, what became known as the Arab Spring. It moved from Tunisia east toward Libya, eventually saw the deposing of Muammar Gaddafi, who was killed, and everybody in the West thought this was a good idea. It's a wonderful thing. The people are taking their countries over by democratic style from the bottom up, not from the top down. By 2011, Iraq was showing us that trying to impose democracy from the top down wasn't working out so well. And we thought it was a good thing. This moved further east across toward Egypt, where they deposed or got rid of Hosni Mubarak. And then they got to Syria, where Bashar al-Assad was the president of the country. Bashar al-Assad is the son of Hafez al-Assad. Hafez al-Assad faced a similar crisis in the 1980s when people rose up in Syria against him. He crushed it. And his son, Western educated doctor, did the same thing, took out the Syrian hammer and crushed the uprising. It started a movement of Syrians, outflow of Syrians into the Mediterranean and into Europe, and specifically Germany, that caused some internal stresses in a nation that was already under stress. Now, this led to the rejuvenation of some right-wing movements that have been pretty much marginalized inside of Germany. And I say this with great emphasis because Germany has been a nation that's been very intentional about reminding itself and its population and working into its educational system the story of the Holocaust. In other words, the Germans have been very intentional, saying that we want to remember this because we don't want to do this again. But such was the pressure inside of Germany and the population pressures that even with the Holocaust hanging over them as a long shadow, people still move toward the right. This is how much pressure they were feeling. By 2013, the spring of 2013 saw an influx of Ukrainian refugees fleeing the civil war, civil unrest caused by mass protests. People fled mostly to Russia. Syrian refugees continued to enter Germany, while dual conflicts in the Central African Republic and Sudan had led to swirling movement patterns. Now, about the Central African Republic. The Central African Republic, or the CAR, as I refer to it, has had an ongoing war between Muslim and Christian-backed militias, and they are equally vicious with each other, which of course has produced some difficulties for Central Africa. It's a bad place to have a conflict like that when you already have grave instability in the Democratic Republic of Congo, instability in Chad, instability in Sudan, instability in the Horn of Africa, in Somalia, and not a whole lot going on in West Africa as well. 2014, Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 produced an explosion of refugees in Ukraine. South Africa also began accepting people by the hundreds of thousands as they came from Somalia and landlocked countries from further inland. Now, again, if you're coming from someplace to South Africa, I've heard all kinds of stories from African colleagues, about South Africa. It is a great place to go, but it's got a crime problem. And the remnants of apartheid have not all been dealt with. So South Africa is better than some places, but it can still be better. By 2015, the Syrian refugee crisis had become by far the dominant movement of displaced persons. By 2015, there were news reports saying that the movement of refugees inside of Europe from Syria was the largest refugee crisis that the European continent had faced since World War II. Think about that for a moment. Since World War II, we're talking global war. That's how bad things had gotten in 2015, just 7 years ago. And then despite political fears, the US remains almost a non-player on the global stage. This map here from 2017 shows the outflow of migration from Iran, Afghanistan, and then from Somalia, Eritrea, because the thing is, this goes all the way back to the time I was an undergrad. The people in Eritrea and Ethiopia have been fighting over a strip of desert called the Ogaden for decades. Decades. It's a strip of sand. That's what it looks like to me, but to them, clearly it means more than that. They've been fighting over it, and we should look at that because there you have the Straits of Hormuz, this is the Persian Gulf area. The Americans have an aircraft carrier battle group on station in that area all the time. This is a major oil transportation route. So this is not just geography, this is also energy. And then of course into Libya, which is still destabilized. Look, Muammar Gaddafi was a bad guy, and the world is better without him. However, Libya has fallen into civil war, and it's not completely stable yet. There's still competing militias inside of Libya. And the Mediterranean countries, Greece, Malta, Cyprus, Italy, all those countries have been under pressure as well. And the Jordanians have done the best they can by accepting people, but they're a small country with a Hashemite kingdom, which at times itself is not so sure of its own survival. And in Syria, the Syrian regime, Bashar al-Assad, has to be in a position to survive because Bashar al-Assad belongs to a group of people called the Alawites. They're a minority inside of Syria. If he does not keep control, there will be hell to pay for the decades of oppression that the Alawites have imposed upon the Syrian people. So as long as the Alawites are in charge, they're good. But the moment that something happens to Assad, folk have a long memory. there will be victor's justice to be dealt with. Now, as a result of all this different movement of population, you see there was a rise of right-wing movements in Norway, in Poland, and you see that there, look in the lower right, under the leadership of Prime Minister Viktor Orban, they have moved steadily to the far right. In fact, Viktor Orban has been referred to as somebody who is more of an autocrat than anything else. Illiberal democracies. And when I say illiberal, I'm not talking about the usual simplistic definitions that Americans give to liberal conservative. I'm talking about people that are opposed to, constitutional democratic republics, any form of democracy, not autocracies, but democracy. And then here, this is the thing that I think also we still don't pay enough attention to. The African continent, as the wonderful presentation pointed out, Africa's population is going to double by 2050 in the next few years. Those pressures, particularly in what they call the Bight of Benin, down around Cameroon, if you look at in West Africa, Cameroon, Nigeria, and between those two countries, there's a group of rivers called the oil rivers. And in those rivers, the Cameroonians and Nigerians have been fighting for years. And particularly in the Nigeria Delta, there's a movement called MEND, Movement to Emancipate the Niger Delta, because of the international oil companies for years and years and years were polluting the land and the water. These people are primarily fishermen. That's how they make their living. That's how they sustain themselves. And it turns out that the oil pumping operations polluted the water and polluted the land and killed off their source of food and economy. Now they have become guerrillas fighting against the oil companies, which of course are backed by Western governments who are now waging war on the people. That has further destabilized things in Togo and Benin, even Ghana. I talked to a friend of mine recently who was thinking about relocating to Ghana because it's supposed to be so welcoming to African Americans who are, just tired of the whole American thing. So they want to go back to Africa. I said, send me a postcard. Then there was this. There's this part right here. And this is the part about this kind of discussion that I absolutely love. The Department of Defense every year puts out a climate estimate. Climate change has gotten to be such a big issue for the world. And see, the thing about DOD is, well, up until recent years, DOD has been primarily, people in uniform are generally apolitical. They say, look, you know what? I don't care whether you believe I don't care if you think climate change is a liberal hoax or a conservative, boogeyman. They don't care about left or right. They say, look, our job is to protect you. You give us money to protect you to go fight the wars, and you say you want us to win. And in order to do that, since war occurs out there, not in here, we're telling you what's going on out there. Out there, the desert's getting bigger. Out there, the oceans are rising. Out there, it's getting hotter. Out there, water's becoming more scarce. Out there's a lot of things going on. And if you want us to do that out there, that you say you want us to, and win, here's how much it's going to cost. Here's what it's going to cost. I don't believe you. The liberals, you're not getting it. I don't care if it's a liberal plot. I don't care if it's a conservative plot. Out there, things are changing. Whether or not you believe it or not is irrelevant to the fact that it's happening out there. Now, if I got to carry a full combat load in a pack and go do the fighting you say you want me to do, this is what I'm going to need, and here's what it's going to cost. DOD put out its climate estimate, and we found out coming with this. More drought, more flooding, reduced water supply, critical assets inundated, agricultural production reduced, infrastructure. Why would DOD put out such an estimate? Because it's like this. When people don't have water in their area, they go find it. When people don't have food, they go get it. And sometimes when they go to find their water or go to get their food, other people may say, that's my food or that's my land and that's my water. There may be a dispute. That dispute may break out into the area that causes a region-wide conflict. Conflict always produces a side effect called refugees that go places. Because it turns out that human beings feel a lot safer someplace where there's no fighting than when there is fighting. That population movement, therefore, places strains upon people that are already under strain where they already are, taxing resources. Altered planning and operational requirements to reduce vulnerability. So these are the security implications. So the competition for scarce natural resources, there'll be increased demand for defense support of civil authorities and humanitarian assistance and disaster response. We've already seen that, I think, back in 2004 with the tsunami in Indonesia, when the US Navy was tasked to provide military relief for the Indonesian people, which was a good thing. We had the assets, they're mobile. The US Navy has all kind of sea lift capability. The United States to this day still is probably one of the few countries on earth that has both the land, air, and sea lift capability to deploy around the world with no one else's help. We can do that on our own. A secondary impact of the implications, heightened social and political tensions, increased likelihood of migration, hence our subject, conflict and/or adversaries using instability to expand influence. What does that mean, that last part? Shall we be naive to think that in the event of such instability, that some ambitious warlord, some ambitious leader won't take that moment of weakness in the country to advance their own political aims and wage war upon their own people or another people that are currently destabilized? Should we be naive and think that? No, we're not going to be naive, because that's exactly what happened and is going on right now. And we're also going to take a look at home. What's happening in the United States, where a lot of people are coming. You know, in the United States, we have a history of, well, you know, I don't know of any other way to put it, of treating immigrants like dirt. I think you all have seen this before in another of our presentations. Can anybody see something odd about this picture? This is from the 1840s. This is supposed to be, this is an anti-Catholic immigration cartoon. What do you see strange about that? The alligators are actually people in papal vestments crawling ashore. And look at this. Look, this is 19th century political cartoon, so it's hand-fisted. They intend to beat you over the head. And you'll notice the individual on shore, the man standing there holding the children back. And in the background, of course, there's a US flag and US public school. Message, we got to protect the kids because they're going to come here with their Irish Catholic ways and infiltrate the school systems. And, you know, I guess off there, the distance, you know, with that cross on top must be the Vatican City, where the Pope is going to come in here and undermine the Constitution. Well, all right. You know, the mere fact that John F. Kennedy in 1960 had as one of the things he had to be dealing with was, you know, if he was elected president, would he obey the Constitution or, you know, listen to the Pope first? This to a guy that you know had his PT boat overrun by a destroyer during World War II? Really? Yeah, because that's what happens. And then this one right here. You see Chinese laborers who are living in squalor, and the one of them, I don't know if you can see, one guy eating a rat, and the caption reads, "This is why they can live on 40 cents a day, and they can't." There's one way of doing the right thing. One group of people, clearly drawn to represent uncivilized barbarians, heathens, or to be more blunt about it, animals, and the more ideal type of existence, which is why this guy on the right, this is why he needs a good paying job, as opposed to these people who don't need that much. I mean, look at him, he's eating rats. Scholars have asked, on November 4th, 2008, I was right across the street, downtown, right across the street from the City Flats restaurant, or rather hotel. And that night, I mean, I thought, you know, I was like the rest of the country. That night, when this happened, when this guy was elected, I thought, you know, I heard my mother and my grandparents say that it'll never happen in my lifetime. And I thought, wow, it's happening in my lifetime. I can barely believe it. Talk about demographic change. Now, keep in mind, America has been going through a process called the Brownie of America for the last 10, 20 years. And they say that by the year 2050, that the Brownie of America will become a majority minority nation. I'm still trying to figure that out. So, because the first time I heard that, I said, "What? So we'll finally have the numbers and still be a minority? How's that work?" But okay. Well, it was supposed to happen by 2045 or 2050. In 2008, this cost some people 42 years ahead of time. No one saw that coming. I didn't see it coming. And I've been looking for it. So this happens in 2008. Now, if a man of color can become president of the United States in 2008, then the question hangs out there, what else can happen? The Brownie of America, some states like Arizona, Nevada, Texas are already majority minority or getting that way. And quite frankly, for some people in the country, this simply is not a good thing. And this alarmed a lot of people. So despite all of the jubilation that we saw in Grant Park that night, and it was such a beautiful thing to see all these people from different backgrounds, speaking of demography and demographics, different backgrounds, different faiths, different races, different colors. I mean, this is truly an American celebration. And people were crying and there was hugging in Grant Park. I mean, you know, Chicago has its own issues, but there that night, for that one moment, even people who don't care about or don't know that much about American history, they knew enough to know as Americans that we have struggled with this thing in this country for a long, long time. And that people said, if we can do this, what else can America do? Some people screaming for generations, ancestors, you know, thank God that this has finally happened. Maybe this can be different. Maybe things can change finally. And people begin talking about, we have achieved a level now, we've gotten to a point where there's a post-racial America. That night, over at City Flats, I stood next to, on this side of the street, as I watched people walk across the street to go join the celebration. Because that happened to be the same night that the election returns were coming in for my first congressional campaign. Now, people told me at the start, I probably wouldn't get any more than 3 or 4 votes. They were wrong. I got 5. But I stood there next to a dumpster listening to people going across the street, and they were so happy. They were so warm. I mean, people were just happy about it. And there were some people I recognized who I knew were very staunch conservatives, lifelong Republicans, even they were celebrating. But I couldn't help but think that while there are millions of people who were celebrating that night, millions more saw this as the beginning of the apocalypse. For them, their world had changed. For them, a Black president was the worst of all possible occasions or occurrences. And so a few years later,
universities, the torch-wielding white nationalists coming face-to-face.
A demonstration by white nationalists at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville.
White lives matter! White lives matter! White lives matter! White lives matter!
What you had in Charlottesville was these alt-right people, many of them marching in Trump's name.
It was during this demonstration that I first heard of something called things that they were talking about was something called the replacement theory, that we're not going to let you breed us out or move us out of the way with this replacement theory, literally reproducing more than the majority population. And I thought, what are they talking about? It's another one of those things that, you know, replacement theory, Jews will not replace us. And looking at this demonstration, I said, you know, they generally say that young people are more optimistic and have a brighter view of the future. These are young people marching. These are not 80-year-olds marching. These are young people marching. So much for the future, or at least the broadly more positive future. And
We could see them marching with torches, and it looked like something out of Nazi Germany.
well, so, and you take that, and another thing happened 40 years earlier when this guy right here, I think we got enough time.
Si quieres ahorrar tiempo y mejorar tus ensayos, asegúrate de hacerlo.
He didn't say that.
Con Grammarly. Grammarly es un asistente.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult. Long life, longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming.
It would have been one thing. I've looked at this many times, and I think that the problem with what he said is this. The pull for people moving across the world is the promise of what he referred to. They haven't made that promise over there. In Russia, China, Cuba, Hugo Chavez's Venezuela. They didn't pretend in Orban's Hungary. They're not pretending to have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, laws against unlawful search and seizure. We've made that promise here. And if they had never made the promise, then nobody would expect it. You don't give somebody hope and then withdraw it. But hope was extended to the whole world, and hope is still being extended to the whole world. That's why people come here instead of going to Hungary or going to Iran because they have no place else to go. If they could get here, they would. There's the promise of America, and that's why they come. That's the pull. The push is whatever they're running from. And just a few years earlier, in 1965, Lyndon Johnson had signed the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act the year before. And even before that, Brown versus Board. Lots of changes happening in the country because of the internal migration, an internal demographic shift that started right around 1915, World War I. Except this time, it's not somebody from outside the country, it's from inside the country, moving from south to north, the Great Migration, and the pressure upon urban centers. We talked about urban centers and what they offer. Those urban centers had people living in conditions that compromised their voting rights and their civil rights. It caused changes inside the United States. Lerone Bennett Jr., now deceased, was at one time, for lack of a better way of saying it, the official historian for the Ebony magazine at one time, the most widely distributed African-American magazine in the country. Now, Lerone Bennett Jr., in the early 1972, wrote an article, an essay that said, will this happen again? King was dead by that point. The civil rights movement was fizzling. The 1964 Civil Rights Act was already gathering cobwebs. The 65 Voting Rights Act was being circumvented already. And Laurent Bennett Jr. asked this question. He said, you know, the first Reconstruction gave us the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment that was supposed to have granted civil rights, and the 15th Amendment that gave, sadly, only Black men the right to vote. And now we're going through the second Reconstruction. He said the first Reconstruction failed, and the question now is, well, the second one. How we answer that question will also have an implication on how we answer this question. People who are stateless. We have in the United States many stateless people. Speaking of demography and the situations people find themselves in. What does it mean to be a stateless person? Often denied access to education, healthcare, and other services. May have to join the workforce at an early age, exposure to harassment, discrimination, and predatory practices. No right to a passport, unable to legally cross international borders. The status of statelessness may be passed down to one's children. And clearly an uncertain future and exposure to other forms of insecurity. I won't read through all that. I'd rather tell you all a brief story about this guy, Mikhail Sebastian. In 2011, right when the Arab Spring was starting, that Christmas season, as the fall semester was ending, I was on the way home and heard a report on National Public Radio about this guy, Mikhail Sebastian. Now, speaking of demographics movements, when the Soviet Union fell in 1989, 1990, his family got caught up in that. Now, he is ethnically Armenian. It turns out that his family had been living in Azerbaijan for a number of years. Now, the Azerbaijanis and the Armenians, I didn't know this, but they had no love for each other. Now, because his family had been living in Azerbaijan for a long, long time, when they fled back to Armenia, the Armenians didn't trust him. They thought they had been co-opted. So he couldn't go back to Armenia. But then when he went back to Azerbaijan, they didn't trust him because he's ethnic Armenian. So what he did then was he fled to Turkmenistan. All these are former Soviet republics. He fled to Turkmenistan and got there and discovered that his life was in danger because he happens to be gay as well. And they cut your head off over there in Turkmenistan, apparently. So he came to the United States, no passport. His country, the Soviet Union, doesn't exist anymore. It literally, at that point, was a relic of history. His passport, no longer relevant. So immigration officials, not knowing what to do with him, essentially told him, keep your nose clean, get a job, just stay out of sight, don't cause any trouble, and we'll figure out what to do with you later on. Very busy year. The guy had enough sense to move to California, got himself a couple of jobs working in TV commercials. He became a barista. He's a very resourceful guy. And he also likes to travel. So he made enough money to start traveling to places like Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands. He always made sure that if he went out of the country, it was a US territory or a US possession, something that the US had jurisdiction over. Well, that year, he decided to go on vacation to Hawaii, and he did. While in Hawaii, he heard about a place called American Samoa. So he bought a plane ticket and flew to American Samoa. Well, when he got to American Samoa, he stayed there for a few days. And then when he got on the plane to fly back, he was told by immigration officials that he had self-deported. Because it turned out that American Samoa, while in American Samoa, he caught another plane and flew to some place called Western Samoa. When he did that, he left the American jurisdiction. No one had told him that in 1967, Western Samoa had become an independent country. So there he was, stuck on this island in the Pacific. Can't get back to the mainland. Here's a man that has no country twice. Now, this is one of those NPR reports like they tell you on NPR during their fund drives. I pulled up on the side of the road to listen to this. And then they said, when they interviewed him, they were interviewing him from, he had set up shop in a McDonald's where they had a Wi-Fi on the island. With one laptop and a Wi-Fi, this guy had constructed a Facebook page or some type of a web page, had been sending out letters and notices and all kind of help to journalists and immigration lawyers, anybody that would listen to this guy, the UN, Washington, London, Paris, wherever he could get somebody to give him an audience. And they said, sorry, there's nothing we can do for you. I sat there listening to that, and I thought to myself, sorry, there's nothing we can do for you. And I thought about my time at Camp Lejeune. Whenever we would get in convoy to go down to Cherry Point or to go to Morehead City to load up trucks and amphibious assault vehicles, all kinds of tons and tons of equipment, Marines and all of their equipment, all this stuff to get on board ships, to go across the world to some place, to land on beaches, to run military exercises. I said, it's not that we can't do something for this guy. His problem is that he's just simply not important. All it takes is one person to pick up the phone and say, get this done. So that semester in the spring coming up, I was teaching US foreign policy. I did something that I don't know, I hadn't done it before. All the students who had signed up for that class, I had them meet me the previous semester, just before Christmas. And I said, here's what we're going to do. I gave them the briefing. I said, this guy right here is stuck in American Samoa, and you all are going to help bring him home. Oh, Professor Johnson, I don't want to hear that, but I'm just a college student. Okay, we're going to form into groups. We're going to say, you're going to contact celebrities. You're going to start to harass people on, you're going to harass people on Capitol Hill because they harass us. We're going to return the favor. I said, we divided up into groups, and I said, somehow we're going to help bring this guy home. And when I said, I'm telling you now, before Christmas break, because the first day of class, I don't want to spend a second talking about this. I want you to go home, just already in mind. So when we come in the first day of class, we get busy doing this. And don't you know, those students bid into that project. They started writing letters. They got a hold of Bruce Springsteen. In fact, when the group that was doing the celebrity contact got a hold of Springsteen, I said, well, can I talk to him? They contacted people on Capitol Hill. They got a hold of some immigration lawyers. And then Christiane Amanpour from CNN flew out to American Samoa to interview this guy. Now, let me be very clear about this. This wasn't because of us. She was going to already do that. But he finally started generating enough momentum and churning the water enough to get global attention like that. And I had one group of students says their only job was to write him email. I said, don't let him think that he's alone. Send him an email every day so that he knows that somebody around the world is thinking about him. And they did that every day. He came home about a year later. And about right before the summer this year, he called me and said he had just gotten his citizenship. Okay? But this was a guy who was stateless, and he simply was not important enough. I thought to myself, when the US government wants to go, topple a government, get rid of Saddam Hussein, they moved the military, 500,000 people halfway around the world to do that. But here's one guy that just needs somebody to pick up a phone and help him. So we have some things going on when it comes to demographics and our own internal systems that need to be dealt with. Of course, the world is a problem, and that needs to be paid attention to. But I would suggest to you that given what's going on right now, with different from north to south, because look, the mayor of Chicago, she's guilty of it too, where people in different states are moving migrants from here to there, using human beings like pawns. And you know what? I'm disgusted with all of them. These are people. I mean, at a minimum, they're human beings. So whatever our immigration policy is, my own personal view is whatever the policy is going to be, it should be informed first, foremost, always, that it's immigration policy dealing with human beings of the Imago Dei, made in God's image. And then your policy should outflow from that. Thank you. How may I answer your questions?
We do
Or-
have time for questions. And before you start asking your questions, raising your hand for the mic, Dr. Johnson is going to be teaching another course this term. Some of you already signed up, and it's full. It's critical race theory, but you can still come in virtually. Okay, questions, where are they?
Where did the gentleman land himself?
Sorry?
where did the gentleman you were talking about, where did he end up?
When I last saw him, I saw him on Facebook. He was working at a coffee farm in Rwanda. And then he was working at someplace else in Ghana. And then he was someplace in South America. And I thought, you know, I've been an American citizen all my life. I haven't traveled as much as this guy has. I don't know where he is now, but I have been in contact with him because I said he has agreed to let me write his book, let me write his story. I just got to find him and have him be still long enough so I can interview him.
We've got a friend who's got a DACA situation and has kids who were born in the United States, so they're citizens. And she's actually a nurse at Holland Hospital. And I'm just wondering how long there may be changes in the doc. I mean, it has to be renewed. And I'm kind of afraid, I'm going to be very mad if she loses her.
The DACA is delayed action for childhood arrivals. Right. And I don't know, John, I don't know what thanks for your question, by the way, but I don't know what the future of that program is. I mean, honestly, I was happy when Obama did that because it was a very humane thing to do. My criticism of it was that it was a stopgap measure that had no sunset to it. And so it met the need of the moment, which was great. But what it didn't do was take care of the question that you're asking. So what happens when the two administrations later, it's still not resolved? And so it is part and parcel of, it is emblematic and it's an exemplification of the broken immigration system overall. Okay, which has direct impact on whoever's coming to us or wherever they're going. That broken immigration system is going to have an impact on demography inside the United States. And honestly, this thought ran across my mind the other day when I saw these people being bused from here to there to Martha's Vineyard and then place else. I immediately thought of the SS St. Louis before World War II. The SS St. Louis that fled Europe, with Jewish refugees. They came to New York, turned away from there, went to Florida, turned away from there, went to Cuba, turned away from there, and eventually ended up going back to Europe. Europe at that point, which was already on the verge of warfare. And because Dachau had been opened in 1933 and the Nazis had started building other concentration camps, it wasn't like it was a mystery what happened to these folk if they went back to Europe, but they had no other choice. And I thought, history, I was trying to explain to one of the men at the MCF the other day. He said, history repeats itself. I said, well, human beings aren't that efficient to do something the same way. I said, but there are echoes, right? So if history has any job, is to show us what we did the last time so that we can do better the next time. Because if we do the same thing that we did before, it's going to be worse this time. It's going to be much worse, which is why we shouldn't do it again, whatever it is. Okay.
Fred, a question for you. Ian?
Yeah, this is a question for one of our virtual participants, Fred. Is there a consensus among demographers about the predicted population numbers by 2050 or 2100? Will the food supply and its distribution be sufficient to meet those needs?
I don't know about the consensus among demographers, but I'll tell you what, I've looked at some specific projections for the year 2100. Okay, and understand what 2100 is obviously many decades away. They're saying that if we don't do something about the changes to the climate, and again, this is from somebody from DOD or a similar kind of agency, they don't care whether people believe it or not. They're saying, if you keep on doing X, you will not have enough Y to feed people. So the part of the question that deals with food supplies and water accessibility, and it's not just being accessible to water, it's water that people can use for drinking. Okay, we've seen from Flint and Jackson, Mississippi, that just because you have water nearby doesn't mean that you can use it for what you need. But if we keep on doing what we're doing with the environment, well, that is nothing. We're not enough soon enough. Those questions about numbers will be all mashed into an equation that means that there's going to be significantly less for everybody because the environment can't sustain it. Look, let me share this with you. In 1798, Thomas Malthus, an English economist, said in 1798, the year before the French, 1790, the year before Napoleon Bonaparte came to power in France, he said that if human beings keep on producing and reproducing at their rate and didn't do something to check population growth, he said a situation would eventually happen to where the earth would lose its ability to sustain the human population. Now, Thomas Malthus was an economist, so he thinks like an economist. He thinks in numbers and projections and doomsday scenarios. He's saying this in 1798. That was significantly a long time ago. And we're now approaching, was it 10 billion by 2050? 10 billion by 2050. So there's a whole lot of things that have to be checked in that equation. Yes.
Fred, one of the things I read about occasionally is what many of the academic disciplines refer to as the grand challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And it may vary 10, 12, 14, 7, whatever it is. The grand challenges facing society, facing our world. And if you look at the reading and the presentation this morning, certainly a few grand challenges have been laid out and the difficulties in addressing them is there. I don't want to come across as naive. I'm more of an optimist and I think I'm naive, but how do you feel? Do you feel optimistic that we're up to those challenges? I mean, obviously, if we listen to enough of your presentations, you give us a very realistic picture, but you keep coming back as if you're a prize fighter and there's another round to go. You're not going to give up on us or on society. But are we up to the challenge? I guess is the bottom line. Is not just the US, but globally, are we up to those grand challenges? Are you optimistic or concerned, pessimistic about our ability to rise to all these challenges?
I have a belief. I don't know if you could call it optimistic. The short answer is yes. I think we're up to the challenge, but I think that we're up to the challenge with conditions. And the first condition is that we had to preserve this democracy. That's the first thing. I've been telling people that over the last year and a half, 2 years, I found that more and more what I talk about, at least more and more what I'm personally concerned with, is I don't care, whatever your issue, climate, demography, race, gender, marriage equality, the Supreme Court's decision on abortion, whatever it is, none of that's going to matter if the democracy, it collapses on itself. Our first job as American citizens is to maintain the democracy, because if it goes away, none of that will matter. The only way you get to have a debate about any of that kind of stuff is to have a free, fair, open environment where people have a democracy to have those discussions. So yes, we can meet them, but we first must tend to the business of maintaining a constitutional democratic republic. George Washington in 1796 gave a warning in his farewell address. People like to talk about Washington's farewell address and the warning about foreign entanglements. Washington also gave a warning about people who would come along and use the system to destroy the system. He said that in 1796, well over 200 years ago. We have been warned. The only question is now, what will we do about it? So our challenges will be met, our government will be met, our democracy will be as strong as we choose to be. I choose to believe that we will choose to do that. I've seen evidence of it. I look in the eyes of those men at the Muskegon Correctional Facility. They know who they are, what they've done, and but they still have hope for themselves. And they have hope for themselves there, inside there. I gotta have hope for me and you and us out here, that we will do the right thing, that we will preserve this democracy, and that we can meet those challenges. John F. Kennedy said there's nothing confronting human beings on earth that weren't created by human beings that cannot be resolved by human beings. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1941, people should be free from fear, free from want, and have freedom of worship and freedom of speech. Those 4 freedoms remain consistent. Yes. And so if that makes me an optimist, okay, I'm an optimist. We can meet the challenge. There you go. What's this? Native American? Yes, it is. John's asking, is this guy Native American? Yes, it is. The word related. Right. Thank you so much. Thank you for your question. Thank you so much. And yes, good seeing you all.